The confusion you've been living inside was not a malfunction. It was a message. And the reason no one around you could help you decode it, the reason every conversation you had about what you were feeling ended with the other person looking at you with a kind of well-meaning incomprehension, offering words that landed beside the actual thing but never on it, is because the message was not for them. It was never meant to be translated by someone on the outside. It was meant to be received by the only person who had access to the frequency it was being transmitted on. You. But here is what you couldn't have known while you were inside the confusion. The thing you were receiving was not a problem to be solved. It was a truth being revealed. And the revelation was arriving slowly, carefully, in a sequence that required you to sit inside the uncertainty long enough for the deeper layer to become visible. The layer that exists beneath every explanation you were offered, beneath every logical framework you tried to apply, beneath every attempt to make ordinary sense of something that was never ordinary. What you are about to discover about the confusion you've been carrying is going to permanently reframe everything that didn't make sense. Stay with this. Let's begin with what the uncertainty actually felt like, because it deserves to be named precisely, not softened into something more comfortable than it was. It wasn't simple confusion. Simple confusion has a shape. You don't know which way to turn, so you gather more information, and eventually the direction becomes clear. What you experienced was different in its nature entirely. It was the kind of uncertainty that persisted even when you had information, even when you had prayed about it, even when you had sought counsel, done the inner work, sat with it in silence long enough that clarity should have arrived by any reasonable expectation. It didn't arrive. Or it arrived in fragments, partial, elusive, enough to keep you moving but never enough to fully settle the question underneath the question. And the question underneath the question was this: is there something wrong with me that I cannot find solid ground? You felt it but could never put it into words. The sense that everyone else seemed to be operating from a certainty you didn't have access to. That other people woke up knowing who they were, what they were doing, where they were going, and you woke up into the same layered fog that had been there the day before, the week before, the season before. Not depression exactly, not confusion in the clinical sense, something more specific and harder to name. A kind of spiritual disorientation. The feeling of someone who knows they are supposed to be somewhere, but cannot yet read the map clearly enough to take the next step with full confidence. Only a chosen one understands this feeling. And here is the first thing that needs to be said about it. The fact that you could not find solid ground in the ordinary places, in the answers that satisfied other people, in the frameworks that resolved other people's uncertainty, was not a deficiency. It was discernment. It was the most spiritually sensitive part of you refusing to settle into a ground that was not actually solid, refusing to call certainty what was only comfort, refusing to accept a smaller explanation for an experience that was operating on a much larger scale. Your confusion was your integrity. Here is something that the spiritual traditions have always known but rarely say clearly enough to actually reach someone in the middle of it. Confusion precedes revelation. Not sometimes, not occasionally for certain types of people under specific circumstances. Always. The confusion is not the absence of truth. It is the announcement that a truth too large for your current framework is trying to arrive. Think about the moments in your life, the ones that look, in retrospect, like the most significant turning points, and notice what preceded them. There was almost always a period of disorientation first. A period where the old map stopped working before the new one became available. A gap, sometimes very uncomfortable, between releasing what you knew and receiving what you couldn't yet see. You have lived through several of those gaps. You know what they feel like from the inside. And what they feel like from the inside is not like spiritual preparation. They feel like spiritual abandonment. They feel like the silence of heaven, the withdrawal of clarity, the strange and isolating experience of being unable to locate yourself on any map you previously trusted. But here is what you could not see from inside those gaps. You were not being abandoned. You were being repositioned. The old map was not failing, it was being replaced. The framework that had carried you to that point had reached the edge of its territory, and what was being prepared for you next existed beyond the boundary of everything the old framework could chart. The confusion was not a sign that you were lost. It was a sign that you were approaching unmapped territory. And unmapped territory, by definition, cannot be navigated by maps drawn for somewhere else. You sensed this before anyone told you. That's why the ordinary answers never fully satisfied. That's why the conventional wisdom felt like it was describing someone else's experience, not yours. That's why you kept returning to the uncertainty, even after conversations that seemed to resolve it, because something in you knew that the resolution being offered was too small for the actual question. The actual question required a different kind of answer, and that answer is arriving now. Let's go somewhere that most people never go in this conversation. Let's go beneath the confusion to what was actually living inside it. Because the uncertainty you've been carrying was not empty. It only looked empty from the surface. Underneath the disorientation, underneath the fog, underneath the exhausting experience of not knowing, something was growing. Something that could not have grown in the clarity you were asking for. Something that specifically required the conditions of uncertainty to develop in the way it needed to develop. Think about what grows in darkness. Not what dies in darkness, what grows. The seed doesn't develop in light. The seed develops underground in the absence of the very thing it is eventually going to reach toward. The darkness is not the enemy of the seed's becoming. The darkness is the environment the becoming requires. Your uncertainty was the soil, and what was growing inside it, invisibly, slowly, in the hidden dimension of your inner life, was a knowing that could not have developed any other way. Not information. Not certainty in the surface sense. Something deeper and more durable than both of those things. A knowing that is rooted so far below the level of thinking and deciding and explaining that it cannot be shaken by circumstances, by other people's opinions, by the silence of seasons, or by the absence of external confirmation. This explains something that never made sense. This explains why the periods of confusion in your life consistently preceded the periods of your greatest clarity. Not the clarity that came from resolving the confusion intellectually, but the clarity that arrived suddenly, fully, from somewhere beneath the thinking mind, as if a door had opened that you didn't know existed and light was coming through it from an entirely different direction. That kind of clarity cannot be manufactured. It cannot be rushed. It cannot be produced by thinking harder or trying more consistently or forcing a resolution before the growing season is complete. It arrives when it arrives. And when it arrives, Everything that came before it, including every confusing, disorienting, groundless moment, is suddenly revealed as preparation. Now let's talk about why you specifically were given this particular experience of uncertainty. Why the confusion ran deeper in you than it seemed to in the people around you. Why the groundlessness lasted longer. Why the answers that satisfied others never fully satisfied you. There are people in the world who carry a surface-level assignment. Their calling is real and valuable, but it operates within an existing framework, a framework that the world already has the language for, the structure for, the roadmap for. These people can access the maps that already exist. They can receive guidance from people who have traveled similar roads. Their uncertainty, when it comes, is relatively resolvable because the territory they're navigating has been navigated before. And then there are people who carry something different. People whose assignment does not fit within the existing frameworks, not because they are above those frameworks, but because what they are meant to carry, what they are meant to build, what they are meant to offer to the world has not yet been fully expressed. It exists in the territory beyond the current edge of what has been mapped. These people cannot use the existing maps, not because they are incapable, but because the map for their territory hasn't been drawn yet. And the process of their preparation, the process of becoming the person who can navigate what no one has navigated before, involves a sustained encounter with uncertainty that people carrying surface-level assignments will simply never experience. You are the second category. This is what others could not understand. When they offered you their maps and you couldn't locate yourself on them, it wasn't that you were reading the map incorrectly. It was that the map genuinely did not contain your territory. When they offered you their certainty and you couldn't quite share it, it wasn't that you were less faithful or less willing or less capable of trusting. It was that the certainty they had access to was calibrated for a different destination than the one you were moving toward. You were never going to find solid ground in the places they found it, because your solid ground is not located in the same terrain as theirs. Here is the major revelation, the one that changes the entire story, the hidden spiritual truth that the confusion was protecting. The confusion was a guardian. That is the word that fits most precisely. It was standing between you and a version of yourself and a version of reality that you were not yet equipped to hold, not because you were unworthy of it, but because receiving it before you were ready would have been like pouring a depth of water into a vessel that had not yet been formed to hold that depth. The water would have spilled. The weight would have distorted the shape. The very thing meant to fill you would have become the thing that overwhelmed you. So heaven used the confusion as a kind of holding space, a protected environment of uncertainty that kept you searching, kept you growing, kept you developing the specific internal capacity that the truth, when it fully arrived, was going to require you to carry. Everything suddenly makes sense. Because the truth you were being protected from receiving prematurely is not a simple truth. It is not a piece of information that, once delivered, can be filed away and referenced when needed. It is a living truth, a truth that changes the way you see everything, that reorganizes your understanding of your past and your present and your future. That requires a version of you that has been through enough to receive it without it collapsing under its own weight. The truth is this: your life has been operating on a level of spiritual significance that your ordinary perception was never designed to fully see. The events that felt random were not random. The people who appeared and disappeared were not accidental. The timing of every opening and every closing was not arbitrary. There has been an intelligence, a patient, precise, unwavering intelligence, operating in the background of every chapter of your life, orchestrating with a care and a specificity that you will only fully recognize from the vantage point of understanding what everything was building toward. The confusion was not the absence of that intelligence. The confusion was the experience of being inside a story too large to see from any single point within it. Like standing inside a cathedral and trying to understand the architecture from a single corner. The design is real. The coherence is real. The beauty of how it all fits together is real. But you cannot see it from inside a single corner. You need the elevation. You need the perspective that only comes with time and distance, and the willingness to trust that the corner you're standing in is part of something larger than the corner itself. You are getting the elevation now. Let's talk about the isolation that came with the confusion, because it compounded everything. Not only were you unable to locate yourself on the existing maps, you were largely unable to explain that inability to the people around you. So the uncertainty became a private experience, carried alone, processed in the quiet, emerged from in the public spaces looking functional while internally you were still navigating something you hadn't yet found the words for. This is the loneliness that chosen ones carry that no one talks about honestly enough. Not the loneliness of having no one around. The loneliness of having people around who love you genuinely and still cannot quite reach the place where the actual question lives. The loneliness of being known on the surface while the interior experience remains, somehow, untranslatable. You felt it but could never put it into words. The experience of being in a room full of people and still feeling the specific aloneness of someone whose inner life is operating on a frequency that the room doesn't run on. Not superiority, not rejection of the people in the room. Just the quiet, persistent awareness that what is most alive in you is not what is being engaged in the conversation. Here is what that isolation was actually doing in you. It was developing your relationship with your own inner authority. Because when you cannot outsource your navigation to the maps other people provide, when the frameworks they offer don't reach the territory you're in, you are forced, slowly and sometimes uncomfortably, to develop the capacity to receive guidance from within. To learn to distinguish between the voice of fear and the voice of genuine knowing. To recognize the particular quality of the signal that comes from the most spiritually attuned place in your interior. The place that knows without being able to explain how it knows. That perceives without being able to fully articulate what it perceives. This capacity, the capacity to hear your own inner authority clearly, is not common. It cannot be taught in a classroom or cultivated through intellectual effort alone. It grows through exactly the conditions you've been living, the sustained encounter with uncertainty, the inability to outsource your navigation, the forced development of the interior listening that happens when exterior confirmation is unavailable. Most people will never develop this, because most people will find a framework before the development is complete, will locate a sufficient map and stop searching before they reach the territory that requires the deeper navigation. You kept searching because you had to, because the territory you were approaching didn't give you the option of stopping at a sufficient map. And now you can hear, more clearly than you have ever been able to hear, the guidance that was always there, underneath the confusion, beneath the noise, waiting for you to develop the internal ear that could receive it. Here is where the confusion begins its final transformation into clarity. The hidden spiritual truth that was living underneath everything you didn't understand about your life is not one thing. It is not a single revelation that arrives and resolves everything in a single moment. It is a layered unveiling, a process of seeing more and more clearly, in an expanding sequence, as the capacity to hold what is being revealed continues to grow. But there is a first layer. There is a foundational truth that, once received, reorganizes how every other layer is understood. And that truth is this: you were designed for this specific life, not a version of it adjusted for comfort, not a version of it modified to be more legible to the people around you. This life, with its particular confusions and particular depths and particular experience of sustained uncertainty, was designed for you because you were designed for what this life is preparing you to carry. The confusion was not an obstacle to your purpose. The confusion was part of your purpose. The uncertainty you navigated was developing in you the precise qualities, the depth of perception, the inner authority, the capacity to hold complexity without collapsing it into false simplicity, that the next chapter of your life is going to require in full measure. You were not confused because something was wrong. You were confused because something was right. Something was growing in conditions that required the confusion to remain until the growth was complete. And the growth is reaching completion. There is something shifting in you right now, not because of anything outside you, but because of everything that has been accumulating inside you through every season of the hidden years. Something that has been developing in the underground is crossing the threshold into the visible. The clarity that has felt distant and elusive is not distant. It is here. It is arriving in layers, in the way all genuine clarity arrives for people who carry what you carry, not as a sudden illumination that resolves everything at once, but as a steady brightening, a progressive focusing, a morning that has been building before the full light is visible. You are in the early light of that morning right now. And here is what the clarity is going to reveal as it continues to arrive. It is going to reveal that the things you thought were detours were directions. The things you thought were failures were formations. The things you thought were losses were clearings, spaces being made for something that could not have entered while the previous things occupied the space. It is going to reveal that the people who couldn't understand you were not failures of relationship. They were indicators of specificity. They showed you, by the contrast of their incomprehension, the contours of what you actually carry. Every conversation that ended in the frustration of being partially understood showed you, in negative space, the shape of the understanding that was coming, the understanding that would arrive from people and places and internal experiences calibrated for your actual frequency. It is going to reveal that the length of the uncertain season was not evidence of heaven's inattention. It was evidence of the precision of heaven's care. A preparation this specific, this deep, this architecturally complex could not be rushed without compromising the integrity of what was being built. The time was not wasted. The time was the work.
The clarity that has been assembling itself in the hidden dimension of your life is arriving now. In this season, in this specific window of time that you are living through right now. Not a distant promise, not a future event that require further waiting of an undefined duration. It is a present reality that is already beginning to recognize the surface of your experience from the foundation that has been laid in the depth. Your season is changing. The quality of the ground beneath you is different than it was. You may not have the full language for this yet, but you can feel it. That subtle but unmistakable sense that something has shifted, that a pressure that was a present is beginning to lift, that a clarity that felt perpetually out of reach is now close enough to sense. The shape of it before it fully arrives. That feeling is accurate. Trust it. Your preparation was not wasted. Everything was went through inside the confusion. Every moment of disorientation, every night of sitting with the uncertainty, every day of moving forward without the confirmation you were asking for, all of it was investment. All of it was underground work of the foundation being laid for something that requires exactly the depth that the confusion produce. Your uniqueness was intentional. The specific way you are weird, the depth of your perfection, the sensitivity of your spiritual anthema, the intensity with which your experience, both the confusion and the clarity that follows, was not an accident of temperament. It was a design specific specification. You were made with the particular sensitivity because what you are going to carry requires someone who can sense at this frequency, who can perceive at this depth, who can negative the kind of terrority that most people will never be asked to enter. And your story is still unfolding. The chapter you are in right now, the one where the confusion is giving way to clarity, where the underground is beginning to surface, where what has been hidden to beginning to become visible. This is not the ending of your story. It is the turn, the moment the narrative has been moving forward, the moment where everything that comes before it reveals its purpose and everything that comes after it becomes possible. The hidden spiritual truth was never hidden from your permanently, it was hidden from your temporary, for exactly as long as the preparation required, and the preparation is rich, its complexion, the confusion served its purpose. The uncertainty did its work. The isolation developed what was sent to develop. And now is the season is in this moment the clarity is arriving that makes all of it make sense. You never lost. You were always being led. The confusion was never the absence of direction. The confusion was direction moving you through the specific terrain. That process, the specific you that the next chapter requires. Heaven never lost track of you for a single moment. Not in the longest season, not in the deepest uncertainty, not in the most isolating stretch of the hidden years. You were always the primary concern. You were always the main event. And everything that happened in the confusion was happening in service of what was always coming, the clarity, the breakthrough, the season of visible fruit from invisible roots, the arrival of what The preparation was always building toward. It is here, it is arrived, and you, the version of you that the confusion produced, are finally fully ready to receive it.